It's the way we start these off.
For the boys.
Reminds me of the thought experiment they had of whether like Coors Light for the boys or the milkshake bringing all the boys to the yard. And it was like, which comes first, like the chicken or the egg? And they're like, well, all of this is determined based on whether the boys are back in town or not. And it was like, oh, absolutely beautiful.
Hey, welcome to Tabletop Talk, where we talk about Dungeons, Dragons, tables, and talk. I think I got that right, Kyle?
Something in that order, yeah.
Great, that's
Occasionally
why...
TVs, too.
Oh, yeah! That's why I'm today's host. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Kyle.
And with us today...
Oh, is Rick.
Great, he's still here.
Worried about that for a moment there.
Anyway, let's start off. How are you guys doing on this rainy day?
I'm okay. I mean, it's been raining all day, so the weather clearly rolled a 5 or something on the random encounter. But other than that, I'm good. You know, I've been pretty productive. How about you, Rick?
The sun came out, so whether it was for a small amount of time or a large amount of time, we got to see blue sky and sun for a little bit. So
Yeah.
cheers my heart a little bit.
I'm with you there. I got to walk outside for maybe about 5 or 10 minutes in the sun. And
Ooh, you got spoiled,
I
man.
know.
I thought you looked darker.
That's basically a sunburn for someone in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought something looked different. I was like, did you go in and get a tan? 5 minutes in the sun, that makes sense.
Now, anyway, before we dive in, Kyle, I believe you had something you wanted to share with us.
Oh, yeah. Normally this is Dr. RPG's job, but since Trevin isn't with us today, I did actually find a study that I sent to, I think both him and Chris are producers, so I'm hoping I sent it to Chris. It was a video that talked about it, but it was talking about how they did an experiment with 5 kids who were kind of considered rejects in their class in middle school. I don't remember the actual varying ages on there, but essentially they had the lowest grades. They were considered to be not exactly part of the cool kids or anything, and had a lot of social issues. But about halfway through the year, all of a sudden they became some of the top rated kids in their class on grades and actual making friends and such. The only difference was that those kids were encouraged to play Dungeons and Dragons together, which helped with a lot of their social uptake and a lot of their focus on learning.
I think that's great because, I mean, when you say focus on learning, yeah, I 100% get that because I have done so much reading on how to build a player that my DM will find really funny and really irritating.
Ha ha ha. Ha.
Yeah, it's not Kyle. You're not my only DM.
I know,
do
I'm
it to
not.
all DMs.
I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying I'm very much aware as one of your DMs. No.
It takes a lot of learning to do that, and I think that's what those middle schoolers did. They were like, how can we be total bosses right now? Let's learn.
Well, and you look at just the overall benefits of what any type of tabletop or role-playing game can do. Like, there's a lot of critical thinking, there's a lot of decision making, and a lot of aspects that go into that are going to increase their social awareness, their ability to work with others, like their team building. All of that is all built into something fun, which if you can mask learning as something fun that doesn't seem like learning, guaranteed win.
For sure. And it helps with like somebody help me with this word.
Carpe diem, carpal tunnel,
Magic
carp.
compartmentalizing.
Thank you, Rick. Man, you guys are just
The best.
you're something. It helps with those skills because, like, when you're playing, for example, like a druid or a wizard or even a bard, you have like things like spells, and you have all these different feats and abilities you can do between any of the classes. So you have to kind of really focus and learn certain little things and keep track of all of it at once. So,
well, and just going into like the theater aspect of it too, Kyle and I we're both I was a somewhat theater kid. Kyle was 100% more of a theater kid than me. He was always in the theater. I did a couple plays, but as someone who acted, like when you act and you're portraying a character, it's so much fun because you get to take a break from yourself and embody this other thing, and you learn more about yourself from doing that.
Well, it's because you kind of lose yourself a little bit to the character sometimes, and so you start to take on a whole new thought process that's not your own. And I think it gives a good level of empathy towards other people in realizing, sometimes the bad guy really doesn't think they're bad. And that, as a DM especially, that helps with like coming up with villains and such, and coming up with more interesting storylines.
Yeah, so all these, middle schoolers and high schoolers out there who are just chopping heads off of orcs and raiding villages are learning and excelling at school.
Yep.
I mean, you're already halfway through Macbeth right there. So,
All right, now I'm going to bring it back, and we're going to dive deep into the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide on two things. There's going to be one that's kind of a controversial rule that many DMs leave out of their game, and the second one is a rule that I think a lot of players think is a bland action, a bland thing to do, and they will rarely do it if its rules is written. And because of that, I think they're going to ask too much, or they're not going to use it, and I want to ask you guys about that.
okay.
So we're going to begin first with the controversial. We're going to talk about flanking.
Oh, flanking.
Says the DM.
That is the visceral response I knew I would get from Kyle, because flanking is torturous for people who really care about their players and care about themselves and care about the game and game flow. And so that's why we're gonna talk about flanking. Now, Rick is going to actually do the reading for us for flanking. He's on page 251.
He's got the rules up and everything.
Page 251 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Take it over, Rick.
Yep. So, if you're reading from the book along at home, there is quite a bit more to the blurb on flanking than what I'm about to read. I'm going to read just the core basics of it for if you're playing with miniatures on squares. When a creature and at least one of its allies are adjacent to an enemy and on opposite sides or corners of the enemy's space, they flank that enemy, and each of them has advantage on melee attack rolls against that enemy.
Okay, thank you. And just to add further context to that, so you get advantage on your rolls if you're flanking. Now, according to a Reddit thread from 8 years ago and user Warskull, thank you Warskull, always a delight, the flanking for a roll with advantage is 13.825 on average.
And how many, the simulation they ran, how many rolls was that?
Well, this one was just a formula, but there was also a simulation that Isaac Priestley did with 1 million simulated rolls, and his number came out really close, and it was 13.82.
Sounds about right.
So with the mathematical formula, 13.85. With 1 million rolls, 13.82. They're very close, in my opinion.
Seems
and I
like
think they're fine.
I was going to say,
yield of data.
it's in the green zone.
Anyway, your average roll with a D20 is 10.5. So if your average roll with advantage is 13.85, you have a +3 and a little something, right? On average.
About, yeah.
So it's like anyone who's flanking has a +3 weapon, which is wild, really great for those who are attacking. So should this be used in your game or should it not?
So I am a perennial player. Never DM'd. I've only ever once had the notion to DM, and it was on a homebrewed Legend of Zelda Hyrule map that never went anywhere. But I had a lot of fun building lore.
That's pretty cool. Me and Jeremy talked about doing that at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
But I'm a perennial player. Like as much as I love this, and as much as I have my creative mind, I was an English major. There's too much. It's like, as a huge, obsessive, fanatic sports fan, and baseball particularly, I can't keep score in the game, like in a scorebook, because it's too much happening that I can't focus on what's happening. Same thing if I try to DM. There's just too much. So I'm a perennial player. I love the idea of a flank because of that +3. Because if you equate a +3 to everything else in the game, that's better than pretty much any race modifier, feat modifier, or level modifier. Almost all of those are at best a +2.
Or weapon that you can find.
I mean, honestly, people really don't understand how insanely broken advantage is.
Yeah, I'm a huge Magic the Gathering player. Like that's where, other than like some D&D playing, that's where like the other like huge nerddom of mine is. If a +3 modifier to a power on a creature of mine were available, I would stack my deck with a bunch of instants, enchantments, and artifacts that would give me a +3 every time. Like, you don't say no to that. Like, that's a huge advantage.
Right.
I would take it every time. But that's also coming from my perspective of a perennial player, not the dungeon master, where I have to focus on the whole game and all of the aspects. I'm focusing on my character, and yes, that's a great idea.
I'm about to explain why you are wrong, and it is a horrible, horrible idea to use the flanking rules. All right, so as a forever DM, if I gave you guys the right to use flanking in any of my games, that means I have to give my villains the rules of flanking. And that sounds like a fair trade-off to some people, but keeping in mind that I use actual tactics already when I game, I mean, a goblin encounter normally for most people is a pretty swift 1-2 turns. They're gone. I mean, Jeremy, he can vouch for this. He's played a couple games where I have run goblin encounters through castles, through woods and such, where the goblins do a real number, and there's only a handful of them because of their hit and run tactics and whatnot. If I were to add flanking on there, I can almost guarantee, I don't care what you gave your barbarian, I will take it down in 3 turns with just like 4 goblins flanking and hit and run.
And I will say that's a good point, because literally the page before the optional rule of flanking in the Dungeon Master's Guide is how to handle mobs when there are dozens of creatures going up against your party. So that's understated how quickly you can have an enemy on both sides of you, and then you're done for.
I mean, you gotta keep in mind, odds are there are going to be more monsters than there are players in a battle.
Yeah, I've played in both flanking and non-flanking game styles, and I always said to every DM, I was like, if you allow flanking, you better bash us with flanking, and not in like a hey, like I've had DMs like that I played with who are like, we don't want to use this rule because it's too OP. I'm like, use it and then abuse it against us, because that's hilarious when you give players something and then the next encounter you use the same thing that they were begging for against them.
That's fair. And I mean, trust me, it's very tempting on a DM side.
Oh yeah, I think it just depends. So it depends on your party style to me. So there are some parties that would be really devastated if you killed all of their players. My other campaign that I play in with family members and friends for a long time. We're a long time coming on this one. It's been off and on for, I want to say like 15 years. But that party would have absolutely no issue with a total party knockout if the DM was super cool with it, because we know the stuff we do is reckless. We know the stuff we do is ridiculous, and sometimes, for instance, we throw caution to the wind and we're like, yeah, let's roll with it. So in that case, I'm like, yeah, I think that DM needs to keep flanking, because 1, makes us feel better when we hit, and 2, like in our current campaign last on Thursday, he did exactly what you did. He surrounded our barbarian, and in the I think it was the first or second round, our barbarian dropped. We were scattered. But what it did do a great job, because they surrounded our barbarian. Once our barbarian was down, and they started to move, they were still in a pack, and so it was like, ooh-wee, area of effect spells.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna say, I knew from the look on your face where you were going with that.
Yeah, but I still in that one I actually love flanking, because it adds this weird effect where you all of a sudden can get trapped. And I love, as a player, I love that panic when you're like, shoot, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I've been at times where I'm like, I got to take 2 or 3 opportunity attacks just to get out of here. And I know they have advantage. But if I can just escape, I'm going to at least get to someone else or somewhere else.
Fair
and
enough.
I like
So-
that feeling.
So then, are you for or against flanking? Because you kind of leaned a little both ways there, saying you understood both sides,
Yes.
and that you're for the idea that if you get it, the NPC should get it too. But in your personal preference, which do you
I
prefer?
am for flanking if the DM is using it, and not like holding back, because sometimes like it forces me as a player to have to think about where all of the enemy combatants are in relation to all of my allies at times, and I don't get as reckless or go all the way into enemy lines doing stuff I wouldn't have. I like that style just because I think it adds an element of fear as a player. And so that's where I'm at.
right.
Where
No,
like
yeah,
you
that's
said,
fair.
like you said, you're like, hey, if I added flanking to my goblins, you guys would be dropped, and I'm like, ooh, I like that, because
I know,
as a
you're
player,
the only
I
one
love
who
that.
ever smiles when I ever throw a threat out that's like a joke. You're like, let's do it. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm not really going to lock you guys in a room with 100 chests and 50 of them are mimics. You know?
50 of them aren't.
Surprise!
So that's where I am. I'm at with that one. But I've also played with flanking where some people grant, if someone's already flanked, they grant their ranged person the advantage, because you're like, oh, well, they're flanked, and so they're already distracted. That one I'm against, because at some point you just throw 2 barbarians up there, flank whoever, and you have the rest of your party just shooting
and
crossbows.
honestly, right there, you just brought up the other reason I don't like flanking is because I find more often than not, a lot of players are generally good-hearted and mean well. But you run into a lot of people who, if you give them an inch, they will try to take 3 miles and all. And with that, it gets a little hard to also okay the idea of flanking, because you're going to run into people who will come up with some weird reason why it should count for them to get a flanking bonus. And as for like the archery thing, I mean, I feel like if you're going to add flanking in there as a bonus for the idea of being close, then I think in archery, if an opponent is close to an ally, you need to have disadvantage, because technically
What
you
if
are
you-
shooting at your
Yeah.
friend.
Yeah.
Unless it's Legolas, then
Yeah, well, Legolas doesn't count. The guy is god tier bow level. Like, he's probably one of the few people who could take on Kratos.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting idea. I did see a rule variation for flanking where all it was flanking granted a +1, and that was it.
I know that that's kind of more how like 3.5 used to be. I don't remember the rules off the top of my head, but I think you got like a +3 to your attack if you were flanking.
Because a +1 is something I would still go for as a player to try to do, but I wouldn't go out of my way to do. A +1 is advantageous, but
Right.
it's not a make or break.
Yeah.
And for enemies too, I think, yeah, you surround your barbarian, right, with 4 people. They all get a +1. It's still going to hurt because they're
For
all
sure,
+1, but it's not as crazy. So I think I would prefer flanking as a... I love the chaos of the +3 against us, but I think I would enjoy running campaigns as a DM or as a player if flanking was a +1, because in my mind it makes sense if if you have someone behind your back and someone in front of you, you're going to have to kind of move to shift, and your armor class is going to be a little less, basically, because your shield is on this side and the person's on the other side, and you're trying to figure that out.
yeah.
So that's where I think I'm at. I love the chaos, but I love the chaos of a +3, but realistically, I'm a +1 flanking person, and I think that would roll with most parties.
Yeah, so as the rules stand, unless we went about a homebrew way, I'm not going to add it into my games and all, just because also the DM has so much on their plate, and there's so many times that DM has probably spared you because they forgot something to add to like a bonus damage or
That's
something,
fair.
or you end up sometimes with a DM that Jeremy and I have ran into before that's the kind of person who will give the players advantage, but he won't give the enemies advantage, and then the game just feels broken and you feel too OP.
This priest cast Burning Hands for the 7th time in a row.
Oh no.
Rick, what do you think? Are you still for flanking?
I mean, again, as a player, like I think modifying to a +1 would make it a little bit more universally sound, both from a dungeon master's perspective and from a player's perspective. However, +3 for an advantage, statistically speaking, out of a million, is real hard not to say yes to as a player. And that being said, I normally play as characters who don't really have high armor classes.
I was gonna say in our next one we were planning on doing, you're gonna be a druid, right?
Yep. Which doesn't.
All right, man. I'm just saying, keep that in mind. With careful what you wish for.
Oh yeah. I think it's got at best light armor class. Like no, not real any armor class for like roll saves. If I were to get surrounded, I'd be toast immediately. But I like the risk. The risk and reward is. It's all that's what D&D is about. It's the risk and reward and playing it and being able to experience it. I'd go for it. If my little 3-foot tall platypus were to get surrounded by people, but I'm also flanking a character, who knows? Wild shape can be fun.
No, I like it. Okay, so now we're gonna move on. That was flanking. We're gonna move on to grappling, which I think grappling is. It sounds really bland. And I think
I think that's interesting. You think it's bland.
I think it sounds bland, and I think it's underutilized.
Okay.
So help me, spice it up. I think grappling, when you look at it, it just looks like, the mayonnaise of spices. Sauces. The mayonnaise of sauces, the white bread. I think when you just read it, because you can use an attack action to make a grapple.
Yeah.
And it reduces the speed of the enemy to 0. You can still attack them because you only need to have one arm to grapple. They can still attack you. They can still cast spells. It just reduces their speed to 0. And I think because that's it, someone's like, why would I waste an attack to just reduce someone to 0? So help the players out there realize why grappling is cool. Or the DMs so you can grapple your party.
Well, I mean, honestly, the people who are going to want to grapple to begin with are going to be your barbarians and your fighters, the guys who want them up close. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know a barbarian out there who doesn't love the idea of using one giant arm to like bear hug like a little kobold up to them and just keep pulverizing and like using the handle of their axe to just make kobold pudding.
Yeah. Well, you look at it's kind of the essence of what D&D is. It's tactical role playing and having a situational role within the party.
Yeah.
And if you have a barbarian in your party, you're the tank. Think of it like a MOBA, like League of Legends. If you're playing the Guardian or like tank, like you're supposed to just be there and take hits because you've got the most hit points. Grappling makes the most sense. Like if your barbarian grapples and the opponent or the enemy is not able to move, rogues can swoop in and use their bonus attack that they have.
Yeah.
Your assassins can come in. Your rangers, granted, back to the archery with the ranged advantage with flanking.
Yeah.
You might have a little bit of interesting tactics
Again, that's
there.
where it gets a little sketchy.
But reducing an enemy's speed to 0, if your party is all within striking range,
and
is huge.
honestly, that's really useful, especially against creatures with like hit and run like goblins.
Yeah.
So I do want to do an episode that covers how I run monsters, because I don't run monsters like a lot of DMs I've played with. I use a lot of tactics and logic based on the creature. I have a few books that are like the monsters know what they're doing that really helps with that. Recommend it to anybody who DMs.
Keep going.
Sorry. I lost my train of thought.
Whoopsies, my bad.
He's not bad. He used confusion as a bard.
I did.
I'll keep going.
I was just going to ask you, Kyle. So we're talking about how the players are using it. You're the forever DM. How would you like grapple to be used?
Oh man. I didn't get enough creatures in our last campaign we ran to use them on Brant because we were using some modules, so they were preset things. But do you know how scared Brant would have been, the monk that we've talked about a few times, who is able to move nonstop, avoid getting hit? Jeremy would have lost his poo-poo if he ended up getting grappled because Brant's whole thing, like when you have a fast player character, hit and run tactics are phenomenal. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're taking
The mobile feat.
the mobile feat, where, you know, if you attack someone and you go to leave, they can't attack you back. So a great idea for DMs is to use creatures like ropers and things that naturally like to grapple, or to have a couple goblins like grapple the biggest guy who's charging the rest of the goblins, so they try to trip him up. They do a couple things there, make a couple attacks, and then try and book it out of there with their hit and run action. It now has wasted the speed for the barbarian, so he can't keep up. It stops the monk. I mean, I find grappling to be super useful when it comes to that kind of stuff in tactics sense.
Well, and when you look at what the goal of a party is it's the task at hand, the thing they've been hired to do, whatever, their goal, and everyone's got a role to play.
I think
If the DM can use grappling to essentially eliminate like a rogue's whole role in the party of being the Lightfoot, swoop in, attack, use the bonus action.
yeah, I mentioned barbarian and monk. I totally left out rogue, but exactly, you know, it's you take out the guys who need that mobility.
Yeah, if you eliminate that, that's a whole
that changes up the player's strategy right in the middle of a fight. A DM, they're expecting that their strategy is not going to work out. They're going to have to just improvise most of the way, and that works because their characters are. If you're a good DM, it doesn't matter to you whether your monsters live or die. You obviously get upset if you don't get to use some of the fun stuff with them.
Yeah.
However, it's not exactly like you're worried about keeping your things alive unless he's the BBEG and you were planning on having him come back and forth. That's why I don't recommend having your BBEG, unless it's literally Strahd, be a reoccurring character, because you're very likely to get the like barbarian or someone like Jeremy that's like, all right, well, before the guy leaves, I'm going to book it up to him and then I have to come up with some ridiculous reason why, with all of their special powers and speed, that they cannot catch up to my BBEG.
Yeah. Now, okay, I like that. I just wanted to illustrate and have you guys help me out why grappling is a good thing to use. And in most of the games I've played, or even the stuff I've seen, you know, like on Critical Role, Dimension 20, grappling is something I don't see used that much. And the craziest thing to me is that grappling is an attack. It's not, it doesn't take your entire action.
I do understand that that's, I think, where it makes it come off as unappealing. However, I've noticed that a lot of the people who argue with that are almost totally okay, though, using up their entire turn just to cause a grapple. Like, they're chill with it as long as it does something. I think it's just the fact that it sounds so underplayed. The fact it's only an attack. Because, I mean, it doesn't take very long to get to 2 attacks per class.
Yeah. Yeah, so...
Which you could use 1 to attack and then 1 to grapple, or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's crazy. Like, I've played characters where I'm trying to chase someone down, and I'm like, well, I better attack them. And when you chase them down, you could theoretically just grab them and grapple them, and then the rest of your party is coming up. And I feel like there's so many times that players are just not using this. And thank you for illustrating why, both Rick and Kyle, why it's so useful for DMs and players to use something like this. There's so many things that look bland.
The hard part about it too is that I think a lot of players are not aware of how important action economy is. It is the number one thing for most games, is understanding your action economy. There's a lot of DMs out there that don't seem to understand it either, which that's okay. And I actually would love to get into that on another episode, talking about just how to properly use your action economy, because Jeremy, you're really good about that. So yeah, at some point we'll need to talk about that in the future here.
Yeah, that'll be on another episode. But thank you guys for joining this episode. This episode we've been talking about flanking and grappling. And, you know, until next time, this has been Tabletop Talk. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Kyle.
And I'm Rick.
Peace out, y'all. Dragons are people too.